Well, last week in Sunday school, the kids and I were talking about mountains that we have climbed. And all of us, we looked at it, we tried to look at them from the viewpoint of before we started the hike, while we were halfway through the hike, and near the top. And just about all of us said that we had a misconception of how it was going to be and how it was when we started the hike, except for one of them one kid in our group who runs all the time. For him, it was a piece of cake. For me, however, when I climbed Gray's Peak from the parking lot, we looked up at the mountain and I thought, oh, this will be fun. This will be easy. This won't be that bad. Well, halfway up, I was thinking, this is bad. This is really hard. This is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. And then as we neared the top, I was thinking, I can't go on. This is really hard. We could only go about 20 steps and you'd have to stop and take a breath and go on. And then people coming down would always be saying stuff like, oh, you're almost there. And I was thinking, yeah, right, almost there. I can't make this. Aren't we there yet? And then all of a sudden, we were on the summit and it was beautiful, windy, cold, but it was beautiful. And then we looked over at Torrey's Peak, which is connected to Gray's with a saddleback. And we said, it's not that far. It looks pretty good. That's a nice little jaunt. And then we all became realistic and said, nah, we've done enough for the day. And then as we thought, well, let's get down. It won't take that long to get down. Wrong. It took hours to get down because, we were at 14,000 feet and going down. Well, today in Jeremiah, we're also going to be doing two other passages, Psalms, Psalm 84, 1 through 6, and also Luke chapter 18, 9 through 14, and Jeremiah that was read this morning in chapter 14, verses 7 through 10 and 19 through 22. These were all in the church lexicon for this Sunday. So what I've tried to do is combine them all to see what principles we can gain from them. And the principles that I'm going to be taking from them is that of perspective influences attitudes. And we're going to see these in these passages. First of all, circumstances reveal perspective and attitudes in people. So if we go to Jeremiah and we look in verses 7 through 9, we see that there was this plea for help despite their sinful behavior. It reveals to me sort of a selfish attitude based solely on what is needed and does not come from a perspective of love and devotion to God, but instead displays sort of a me first attitude. So they say, although our sins testify against us, do not do something, Lord, for the sake of your name. For we often rebelled and we have sinned against you. You who are the hope of Israel, its savior in times of distress, why are you like a stranger in the land, like a traveler who stays only a night? Why are you like a man taken by surprise, or like a warrior powerless to save? You are among us, Lord, and we bear your name. Do not forsake us. So I noticed the demanding words, do something. Why are you like a stranger? Do not forsake us. The Lord responds by pointing out their behavior and exposes their perspective of doing what they want instead of seeking God with a sincere heart. For he says, this people greatly love to wander and they do not restrain their feet. So the Lord does not accept them. He will remember their wickedness and punish them. So we also see that circumstances force a change in our perspective and attitude. Their perspective shifted almost to a realistic one, that God is their only hope. In verse 22, it says, do any of the worthless idols of the nations bring rain? Do the skies themselves send down showers? They said, no, it is you, Lord our God. Therefore, our hope is in you, for you are the only one who does this. And then we find also in verses 19 through 21 that points to a change in the attitude that no longer demands, but acknowledges wrong actions with dire consequences. They said that they hoped for peace, but no good has come. It was a time of healing is what they wanted, but there was only terror. Therefore, they acknowledged their wickedness, they said, and the guilt of our ancestors, for we have indeed sinned against you. So notice the words, we acknowledge the wickedness, the guilt of our ancestors. So they conceded that the situation may not change. They said, we hoped for peace, but we only see bad things, and we hoped for healing, but we only see terror. And just so to put it in the context of the situation, they were surrounded by the Babylonians, this was on that last push there by the Babylonians when Israel was going to, or it was Judah at this time, was going to cease to exist. So it was in dire straits, dire times. Well, now let's look at Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, and I'll read that for you. Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, God, I thank you that I am not like all these other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all of my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven. He was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. So Luke here exposes two sets of attitudes, pride and humility. Pride we see in the Pharisee, of course. He's very proud about all the things he does and what kind of a person he is. And then we see humility in the tax collector who wouldn't even look up into heaven because he felt so bad about himself that he wasn't even worthy to be in the presence of God. The perspective of each of these characters in this parable defines their attitude. The Pharisee we see, we are told that he thought that he was righteous on his own so that he viewed others with contempt, whereas the tax collector was viewed by a society already as a terrible sinner because he was a tax collector. But this didn't harden this man. Instead, we see that he wouldn't even look to heaven, and he sees himself not worthy to be in God's presence. He was humble. All right, so I'm going to go to Psalm 84. I'm going to try to tie all these together for you. Psalm 84, 1 through 6 says, how lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Even the sparrow has found a home, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may have her young, a place near your altar, Lord Almighty, my King and my God. Blessed are those who dwell in your house. They are ever praising you. Blessed are those whose strength is in you, whose heart are set on pilgrimage. As they pass through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs. The autumn rains also cover it with pools, and they go from strength to strength till each appears before God in Zion. So Psalm 84 demonstrates a perspective that is God-centered. In verse 2, it says, my heart and my flesh cry out to the living God. Verse 4 says that those near God are ever praising him. And verse 5 says that their strength is in God. So that the perspective that is found in Psalm 84 defines the attitude of joy with God in his presence. They say, whose hearts are set on pilgrimage, they pass through the valley of Baca, and they make it a place of springs. Also, it's further defined with this attitude when they say that they go from strength to strength until each appears before God in Zion. So I want you to note that with the perspective set on being in the presence of God, they adopt the attitude of a pilgrim on a journey to Jerusalem to be in the courts of the Lord. This is what we'll be coming back to. But also I find in these passages is a lot of delusional thinking. We first of all saw in Jeremiah this delusional thinking, and in verse 13, which was not read out loud, Jeremiah asks a question of God. He says, "But alas, sovereign Lord, the prophets are telling everybody, the people, that you will not see the sword or suffer famine, and you will have lasting peace in this place." God responds to him and says, "The prophets are prophesying lies in my name. I have not sent them or appointed them or spoken to them. They are prophesying to you false visions, divinations, idolatries, and the delusions of their own mind." The judgment or consequences of Judas' behavior was still coming. And in Luke, we see some delusional thinking. The Pharisee deluded himself into thinking that he was righteous all on his own because of his own good deeds and his righteous or his religious acts. And then we are told that, by Jesus about this man that he would not be justified before God. But then I have a question about Psalms 84. Does it just demonstrate delusional thinking? In verse 6a, it says, "As they pass through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs." Does that mean that because those committed to the pilgrim way are choosing to view the situation how they want it to be? Aren't they really deluding themselves? Isn't it true that viewing a situation in a different way really doesn't change the situation? It's still the same situation, right? Correct. It is the same situation, but in a way, it may not change the situation by having a different perspective, but it will definitely change how we react to the situation, which again demonstrates the axiom that our perspective determines our attitude. It allows us to recover our strength to face the situation. It allows us to draw our strength from our relationship with God. There are many things in life that we are all delusional about. There are those who think that they are never wrong. Their troubles are always someone else's fault, and they don't admit to that their own decisions and actions have led them to the sad state that they're in. Then there are those who don't want to admit climate change. They say that the world is more resilient than we think, and the weather is just cyclical. And we all know of a certain president who deluded vast numbers of people into thinking that the last election was rigged, was false and inaccurate, and that he actually won. There are those who look at the past and paint a different picture of it than how it truly is. How the West was won is one example of the delusional thinking, how lands were settled with no regard for what was done to the indigenous peoples of the land. There are those who close their eyes to their own spending. They build up their debt so that they can live a certain lifestyle, or worse yet, project a certain lifestyle to those around them. And many of us have deluded ourselves into thinking that we aren't racist, that there is no such thing as systemic racism in our country. This was easy for someone like me who grew up in Montana, where we only had one Black person in our school. And that family was very popular. So we all were able to pat ourselves in the back and just think, man, we're really not racist at all, while at the same time we were treating the Native Americans and the Hispanics poorly. We tend to think that racism has only to do with how whites and Blacks interact, when in reality, it's how whites treat Asians, Latinos, Native Americans, and Blacks, all people of color. Other delusions is how we or I think about the homeless. We see all the tents across our city and someone standing on a corner with a sign, and immediately what comes through my mind is, get a job. Well, the truth is, it's not that simple. They may be able to get a job, but they have no place to live. So they spend so much of their time just trying to survive that getting a job becomes impossible. They carry all their possessions in bags and in carts. And if they do get a job, when they come off of work, they find that their possessions have been stolen. So this not only is not even considering the mental illness factor that is going on there. So it's a terrible cycle. And on the spiritual side of life, we delude ourselves into thinking that we're pretty darn good. Why, look at all that we do for others. Look at the programs we support. We spend X number of minutes and hours praying and studying the Bible. We give money and time to various good causes. We should be a little afraid that we are becoming like the Pharisee, popping ourselves up, but not really being honest about what we really think or how we really are. So we're delusional about our age, our looks, our health, our social status, how others see us. So this leads us to I want us to look now at the Pilgrim way that's found in Psalm 84. We return to that, we look more closely at this in verses 5-7. It says, "Blessed are those whose strength is in you, whose heart are set on pilgrimage. As they pass through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs, and the autumn rains also cover it with pools, and they go from strength to strength until each appears before God in Zion." Many pilgrims in biblical times had to travel long distances to reach Jerusalem. And the terrain was not easy, as Jerusalem was on a hill with an elevation of around 2,600 feet above sea level. In some cases, the pilgrims had to travel down into the valleys before they started ascending the heights to Jerusalem. In other cases, pilgrims started their journeys below sea level and would have to journey uphill the whole way. The psalmist notes that the pilgrim must descend into the valley, which he calls the valley of Baca, which actually means valley of tears. This represents hardship, difficulties, difficult times, and the grind. We too experience hard times and episodes in our lives that can only be described as a grind, in which we don't see an end to the situation in which we find ourselves. This begs the question of how are we going to make it through such times? In verse 6, it says, "They make it into a place of springs." That suggests to me that our perspective in a situation doesn't change the situation as mentioned earlier, but it changes how we can approach the situation and how we navigate it. The last part of verse 6 says, and they make this amazing statement. It says, "The autumn rains also cover it with pools." So first of all, springs and pools suggest refreshment, gaining strength, having the ability to make it through the grind with the refreshment we get from our perspective and from our strength of the Lord as we spend time in his presence. The result of a correct perspective and attitude gives us the chance to go from strength to strength. As the psalmist says in verse 7, until we are able to make it through the grind or into the courts of the Lord. I don't want to make this sound like this is a piece of cake or a walk in the park as you're going through the grind, because we all read things and look at things and think, oh, like we saw the mountain. That's not going to be that bad until we actually get there. Note that the pilgrim's way is through the valley of tears. As we struggle through this valley, it's not easy to stay the course, especially in those situations that is a grind, the one that lasts a long time. For those kinds of situations, they take a toll on one's spiritual stamina, one's ability to hang on. We will falter. We will worry. We will doubt the course that we're on. We'll become exhausted. We will come to think that we can't make it any longer. While it's in these dark times that we will see the work of God, it is in these dark times that we will find pools and see the rains and are able to go from strength to strength, which is what I thought was really good about the story that you did about Haiti and how the rains kind of help people. Earlier, I said that we had spoken in my class about climbing mountains. Well, we also watched a video of some people who decided to hike from Jericho to Jerusalem, which is a 30-mile trek, all uphill with an elevation climb of around 2,600 feet. And it's in an arid and hot environment. In this video, they were saying that they had brought a certain amount of water, but it wasn't enough. And they were running out of water and were melting from heat and thirst. When all of a sudden, they rounded a bend in the path and there was a pool of water. And then later, as they thought that they were nearing Jerusalem, they said there was a series of hills that they had to round. And it seemed like they would round one bend only to see another and another and another until they thought that they would never make it to Jerusalem. Well, they did make it to Jerusalem, and we will make it through our difficult times with the strength of the Lord. I don't know what you're experiencing right now. I do know what we're enduring in our family, but I believe that God gives us the strength to endure, to make it the distance. Remember that perspective influences attitude. So let's say with the author of Hebrews in chapter 12, 1-3, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, that's his perspective, he endured the cross, the grind, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Amen.